else? There was a really interesting it's this sculptor. Um,
Hello, everybody. My name is Serena. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Serena. I'm the manager of Butler and I just want to start by thanking you again for joining us this evening as we celebrate the launch of Isaac Butler's The Method, How the 20th Century Learned to Act, which he will be reading from and discussing tonight alongside A.O. Scott. And I have the pleasure of introducing them. But before I do so, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, I want to thank St. Anne's for allowing us to use their space for this event. If we need to use the restroom at any point, you can find them through the doors on the right in the far corner of the next room. For all of you out in the audience, we appreciate your support in keeping this event as safe as possible by keeping your mask on for the full duration of the event and making sure they are covering both your mouth and nose. At the end of this talk, there will be an audience Q&A, so we'll let you know when it's time to line up at the center aisle to ask your questions at the mic. I know many of you picked up a book when you purchased your ticket, but we have additional copies of Isaac's and A.O.'s books available for purchase at the table where you checked in. For those tuning in via the YouTube live stream, hello, I'm sorry you can't see me, but thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already ordered your copy of The Method, there's a link in the description to do so, and we hope that you check that out. Now, quickly, a bit of background about the book. In The Method, Isaac Butler offers the very first intellectual and cultural history of method acting from its 19th century roots in Russia all the way to its influence in 20th century Hollywood and American culture at large. Along the way, Isaac merges his incisive commentary and historical narratives with character studies that are as entertaining as they are illuminating. Such characters include everyone from Konstantin Stanislavski to Stella Adler to Meryl Streep. What results is a book that the New Yorker says, quote, is like its subject, is forceful, restless, and above all, real. In addition to authoring The Method, Isaac Butler is the co-author of the World Only Springs Forward, The Ascent of Angels in America, which NPR named one of the best books of 2018. Butler's writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Slate, The Guardian, American Theater, and other publications. For Slate, he created and hosted Lend Me Your Ears, a podcast about Shakespeare and politics, and currently co-hosts Working, a podcast about the creative process. His work as a director has been seen on stages throughout the United States. He is the co-creator with Darcy James Arvey and Peter Negrini of Real Enemies, a multimedia exploration of conspiracy theories in American psyche, which was named one of the best live events of 2015 by the New York Times and has been adapted into feature-length film. Butler holds an MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Minnesota and teaches theater, history, and performance at the New School and elsewhere. He lives in Brooklyn. As mentioned, joining Isaac in conversation this evening is A.O. Scott. A.O. Scott is a chief film critic at the New York Times and the author of Better Living Through Criticism, How to Think About Art, Pleasure, Beauty, and Truth. He teaches at Wesleyan University and lives in Brooklyn with his family. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Isaac and A.O.
Hey everyone. I was going to use, this lecture, but I thought it was a little self-important. So, thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you to Books Are Magic for hosting this event, for St. Anne's for allowing us to be here, to Tony for talking with me, and to all of you for coming out, and hello to all of you following along at home. Hopefully this section will be self-explanatory, but real quick, there's maybe just a little bit of background you need to know, which is that the method was really born within a theater company called the Group Theater that rehearsed and performed here in New York City throughout the 1930s. Many of the sort of most famous figures in American theater came out of this company and film, among them Harold Clurman, Stella Adler, Lee Strasberg, who's really the father of the method, Elia Kazan, and the person that I'm about to talk about And they also did these summer retreats where they would work on their acting technique and scream at each other all the time. The summer of 1934 in Ellenville was the most miserable of all the group theater's retreats. The hotel slumped in a soggy state of disrepair. Cheryl Crawford insisted it was haunted. People kept getting sick. On top of that, the play they rehearsed, Gold Eagle Guy, was best summed up by Luther Adams. I think we're working on a stiff. Lee Strasberg seemed more interested in making large visual statements than in fixing the problems of the play, and the company's faith in General Lee declined alongside their willingness to tolerate his anger. As the actors grew disillusioned with Strasberg, Clifford Odets grew disillusioned with the company, and he told Harold Clurman he was quitting. Harold tried to persuade him to stay. Clifford told him he never had a decent role and never been taken seriously. No vision of America's new theatrical hope could justify throwing away his prime years playing crap walk-on parts. Wait, Clurman implored him. A good part will come for you later this year. You're behind time, Harold, Odets responded. He didn't even think of himself as an actor anymore. He was a writer. Ever since audiences had greeted I Got the Blues' second act warmly at the retreat at Green Mansions, he had kept working away on it. And he was also drafting a new play to be called Paradise Lost. He was sick of the groups never producing his work. Harold again begged him to stay, and Odets finally relented. Odets needed to feel important and could not foresee how important he was about to become. As Gold Eagle Guy lumbered through its somnolent tryout in Boston, Clifford Odets told Clurman he yearned to belong to the largest possible group of humble, struggling men. His hunger took him to union meetings at Faneuil Hall, where he watched the fiery oratory of Joe Kelleher, a union organizer trying to persuade boat workers to strike. Odets struck up a friendship with Kelleher, who told him he needed a play they could put on at meetings. After a failed attempt to write the play collaboratively with some of his groupmates, Odets sat down, inspired by a recent taxi driver strike, to write the play himself. 3 days later, he stood up, clutching the pages of a new work titled Waiting for Lefty. Its opening cantankerous jumble of lines announcing the arrival of a new American voice. You're so wrong, I ain't laughing. Any guys with eyes to read knows it. Look at the textile strike, out like lions and in like lambs. Take the San Francisco type, starvation and broken heads. This voice, Odets' voice, is slang drunk, slinging street elocutions with such density and fire that they become poetry. It is the sound of New York in the 1930s, the sound of polyglot immigrant tongues wrapping their rhythms around an English language that is stretching to accommodate them. This voice, which echoes through his plays both great and not so great, is urban, Jewish, neurotic, furious, explosive, and full of yearning. In Lefty, that yearning is for a better, fairer America to rise from the ashes of the Depression. The nation's economic calamity was particularly visible in the New York City where Odets lived and wrote. Hoovervilles, the impromptu shanty towns made up of thousands of newly homeless evictees, covered almost every stretch of available land. Up until 1933, the Tammany machine pocketed most of the relief money coming from the state and gave the rest to its cronies. In 1934, the year the group premiered Gold Eagle Guy, so many people were living in Central Park sheep meadow that the state evacuated the sheep out of fear that they would be slaughtered and eaten. But as nightmarish as the daily reality of life in New York could be, it was also marked by a new kind of furious optimism, a belief that the world could be transformed. We need the courage of the young, Franklin D. Roosevelt had told Oglethorpe University's graduating class of 1932. Yours is not the task of making your way in the world, but the task of remaking the world, which you will find before you. As President, Roosevelt remade the world through the New Deal's reimagination of the contract between a government and its citizens. In New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia reinvented a city's purpose, while communists dreamed of an America without private property. It was a time of hopeful visionaries. Up until Lefty, the group had two prophets of their own, in Harold Clurman and Lee Strasberg. Now, with Clifford Odets, they had a third, one whose plays saw both the darkness of the present moment and the possibility of dawn looming over the horizon. Beginning with a meeting of cab drivers contemplating a strike, Lefty breaks out into a series of vignettes, taking us everywhere from the bedroom to a laboratory where scientists argue the ethics of making poison gas. In its 7 short scenes, Odets dramatizes a world in which all human relations are shaped and degraded by capitalism. Wives leave husbands for richer men. Brother betrays brother by spying on the labor movement. A gifted young doctor is first to be laid off from a hospital because he's Jewish and lacks social connections. One by one, they dream of a better tomorrow. Must they go to the Soviet Union to find it? Or can that better world be found or cultivated here in the United States? Waiting for Lefty chooses the second answer, of course. It's a deliberate piece of agitprop written for a left-wing political benefit. There's a scene in which an out-of-work actor is given a copy of the Communist Manifesto by a producer's secretary who tells him that the meek shall not inherit the earth, but the militants will. Subtle, it is not. Stanislavski would have recoiled from its overt politics, but by the time a cab driver named Agate Keller cries out, "Hello, America, hello, we are the storm birds of the working class, workers of the world, our bones and blood," and exhorts the audience to strike, Odets's convictions and the ramshackle beauty of his writing prove irresistible. Odets wrote Lefty so it could be rehearsed and produced anywhere. The set was a semicircle of chairs. The actors sat on the chairs, and when their vignette came around, they popped up and into the scene only to sit down when it was over. Most scenes called for only one or two people. Odets and Sandy Meisner directed the play, working with actors in their dressing room while Gold Eagle Guy performed. The actors loved it. Harold, Luther Adler said, "The group has produced the finest revolutionary playwright in America." But Lefty was never performed in Boston. Half-staged, unrealized, the play went back in the drawer while Gold Eagle Guy shambled on. Odets's discontent only grew, as did everyone else's. Gold Eagle Guy was, indeed, a stiff. One of the kindest reviews from Brooks Atkinson in the New York Times noted that the group is closer to its ideal than it realizes, and it can safely take the art of acting more easily. They were, in other words, trying too hard. Their work was shown, and they needed to lighten up. Meanwhile, New Theater, a prominent leftist magazine, needed entertainment for its upcoming benefit. Lefty came out of the drawer, and the cast began working on it again. "We rehearsed Lefty without the supervision of an overlord," Elia Kazan recalled. The performance was less directed than played. Over the years in our acting classes, we'd all done scores of scenes like the ones Clifford had written. Still, they invited Overlord Lee Strasberg to a run-through. He gazed upon it like a remote father observing the games of his recalcitrant children. When Odets asked him what he thought about the show, Strasberg shrugged. He felt the whole enterprise was a mistake, and privately told Clerman, let them fall and break their necks. But it was Strasberg who was headed for a fall, not Odets. Toward the end of Gold Eagle Guy's Broadway run, the directors shocked the group's acting company by gathering them all together in the basement of the Moscow Theater and informing them that they were closing down the season. Stella Adler was furious. How could they do this? The company wanted to work together. Strasberg replied, "If the directors had come to you with the decision to continue, you would have protested." "We resent that," the actor Walter Coy said. "As long as we can find something to act," Stella said. "Let's act." She turned to Odets. He had plays, didn't he? He suggested they consider I Got the Blues, which he had now retitled Awake and Sing. How about it? The directors greeted the suggestion with silence, enraging the actors further. There was a play available, a play with good parts for the company, written specifically for them, by one of them, and now the directors wouldn't even consider it? Stella pressed Harold. Why was he countenancing a decision he didn't agree with? Harold kept silent. He had privately urged his fellow directors to keep the season going. He had even suggested they produce Awake and Sing. But, worn out by doing all the work of running the company, Lee and Cheryl had said no. In order to present a united front, Harold feigned agreement, but during the meeting, he was filled with shame. It was Odets' turn to speak up. Awake and Sing was nearly ready, he said, and they should do it. Lee turned to Odets, uttering the words that Elia Kazan would later claim destroyed his standing in the company forever. "You don't seem to understand, Clifford. We don't like your play." The actors decided to help the directors. They would choose the next play themselves, and they gathered to hear Odets read his script out loud. Strasberg did not attend this reading of Awake and Sing. Clerman arrived right as Odets read to them the conclusion of the first full-length method play. "Did Jake die for us to fight about nickels? No. Awake and sing," he said. "Right here he stood and said it the night he died. I saw it like a thunderbolt. I saw that he was dead and I was born. I swear to God I'm 1 week old. I want the whole city to hear it. Fresh blood, arms, we got them. We're glad we're living. The actors' faces were aglow, Clerman wrote. Enthusiasm was unanimous. He immediately told Crawford and Strasberg that they were doing Awakens. What's more, Clerman would direct it. When he told the company, they gave forth a shout of joy and threw their costumes in the air. At around the same time, Waiting for Lefty premiered at Civic Route on January 6, 1935. It was, from the very first scene, a quiver of thunderbolts shot one by one at the crowd. Here was real life, the life of the working class given dramatic form and urgency and a kind of grace by Odette's marvelous ear. The audience laughed, they cheered, they leaned forward in their seats. Audience and actors had become one, Harold Clerman said. Line after line brought applause, whistles, bravos, and heartfelt shouts of kinship. And then, something remarkable happened. As Aga Keller, played by Joe Bromberg, began his stem winder about the storm birds of the working class, an energy started to build within the crowd. When he asked, well, what's the answer? And a few plants in the audience shouted, strike, the rest of the audience shouted right along with them. Strike, 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 strike. And the audience leapt to its feet, applauding, screaming, nearly delirious. Out of their throats came what Harold Clerman would call the birth cry of the 30s. Our youth had found its voice. Waiting for Lefty was a call to action, a play that believed that the struggle for a better world was worth dedicating your life to, worth dying for, and the readership of New Theater wholeheartedly agreed. I was terrified the balcony was going to fall in, Ruth Nelson recalled. I remember the sense of wood in the theater, the sound of wood. We lined up at the curtain call with Clifford because he, of course, played a role in the play, and the curtain went up and down, and every one of us was crying like a baby. The audience, too bewitched to go home, hung around, talking. A few wandered the stage, spellbound by what they'd seen. And the actors? We couldn't sleep that night, Kazan recalled. We straggled north silent streets, Harold Clerman among us. We found a Child's that was open all night, and we lingered over our suppers, not talking too much, stunned by what had occurred. None of us was ever to be the same again, and I suppose we all knew it. Thank you.
I think gives a great flavor of the book, which is full of ideas and personalities, and fittingly for a book about acting and theater, full of drama. And I'm very glad that you started at this moment with the group theater and Waiting for Lefty and Awakens, because it is, I think, really a sort of hinge moment in the story you have to tell, which begins in Russia with Stanislavski with ideas about acting and theater that aren't yet called the method. And then his ideas arrive in the United States in the 20s and 30s, and then really come to prominence and have their full transformative effect on Broadway and in Hollywood after the war, in the 40s and 50s. And that's sort of the story that we all know kind of begins there with Marlon Brando and Streetcar Named Desire. Right. So the question I have to start is, in a way, the kind of the jump or the path from this moment in the 30s to that later, more familiar moment. Because it strikes me that when you're writing about the group theater and talking about the group theater, you're talking about an idea of engaged political radical theater that's part of the left-wing popular front culture of the 1930s. And that, whose ideas about authenticity and realism and the representation of real life have to do with social conditions and political action. And by the time you get a decade and a half later, what we think of as the method is about psychological realism, it's about individual identity, about the authenticity of a single person, expressing their inmost feelings and impulses. So I wonder if you could say something about how that transition happened, how this thing that started in this very political vanguard moment migrated into a very different moment and a very different meaning.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was one of the really fun things to try to trace in the book, right? Is that you have this company in the group theater who are leftists. I mean, Harold Clurman, under a pseudonym, wrote theater reviews for the Daily Worker, you know? I mean, like, you know, and they have this idea of this collective. They're the first real collective theater in some ways in America. You know, that they're going to pay the actors, whether they're in the show or not. They're going to have a permanent ensemble. They're going to train together. They're going to share values of what theater is. And one of those values is Stanislavski's ideas about acting through the lens of really Lee Strasberg. And out of that comes the most individualistic vision of acting, you know, that the world has ever seen on some level once the method really hits Hollywood. I think a few things happen that a few things occur that kind of cause that to happen. One of them is, thank you. One of them is the group theater's not sustainable. The nonprofit theater system doesn't exist at that point, so they're trying to do that experiment that I just detailed on Broadway, which is nuts. And so the company is unsustainable and it splits up and all the people sort of go their separate ways and many of them end up in Hollywood. So that's part of it. So they get absorbed into a money-making system. And they happen to get absorbed into Hollywood right at the moment when the studio system is falling apart. And it's very fortuitous that happens. So, you know, prior to 1948, the studios in Hollywood have these stable of actors who are paid a weekly salary and whose lives they manage and completely control, you know, sort of every detail. And due to a Supreme Court case, that starts falling apart in 1948. And just at that moment, these actors are coming to Hollywood. So it's just at the moment that you need actors who can train, who are trained on their own, who do not need all the apparatus that the studio provides. And the method actually gives them that crop of people to some extent. And so they kind of get absorbed. They start this sort of communist theater company. It's not fully a communist theater company, but it has a communist cell in it. They're very sympathetic to communism until the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And it gets absorbed into American capitalism as part of the post-war order. Everything's getting absorbed into American capitalism, and the method gets absorbed into it. And I think in some ways helps shape it, you know, through those performances in the 50s.
Well, say some more about how that affinity between the method and both changes, maybe certainly in Hollywood, but also maybe on Broadway, took place. I mean, say something in a way about the method of the method. I mean, what were the, because we now sort of think it's kind of everywhere and nowhere. Yeah, and we'll get to that. I want to talk some later about the more recent sort of mythologies and invocations or superstitions about.
Are you mad about that pig carcass I sent you? You know, because I was just getting into character.
I know. Well, I was going to do this as James Lipton. So,
that's good.
My barber couldn't figure it out. The beard.
Yeah.
But the question in a way was what came before?
Sure. Yeah.
And why do you think the method was so powerful in kind of disrupting and to some degree supplanting whatever older other style was there before?
Yeah, but one thing that happens in the book is, you know, because progress isn't linear, you're moving from one country to another and then from one city to another in different art forms, is sort of it's replacing a version of the same thing over and over and over again, which is a technical, presentational style of acting that does not value authenticity and truth. Which I want to say, like, I love pre-method film performance and stuff like that. I'm not denigrating it. It just has a different value system. You know, that is on stage. It was often about, you know, like a presentational presence and oratorical displays. If any of you saw Glenda Jackson's King Lear on Broadway a couple years ago, it's sort of like the only time you're going to see this kind of acting. Where it's like you're looking at the audience the whole time, you know, you're enunciating greatly. It's like Laurence Olivier in Hamlet, if you've seen his Hamlet, where he's just sort of posing, you know. And so on stage, it was really replacing that. And it was replacing that with an idea that actually what good acting is the embodiment of lived truth. character in their specifics. So you're not playing a type, you are playing a human being. And that human being lives in a specific social context, they have specific things that they want, they have non-standardized ways of expressing emotion, right? Instead of, you wouldn't go like this if you were upset, you would really cry. It's stuff like that. And so that's sort of what's going on both in Russia in the 1890s through 1920s, and then in the United States when the Russians start coming over. But they also hit a New York City that's really primed for that. And the reason why is spaces are getting smaller and better lit. Part of this story is actually a technical material one, in that you no longer have to project your voice and emotion to the back of a 1,000-seat house that's lit by candles. It's now electrically lit, the houses are smaller, the acoustics are better. So some of it's just that, but it's also that theater in the United States kind of lagged behind Europe in the embrace of seriousness and the embrace of naturalism. And it gets caught up really fast in the 1920s, particularly starting with O'Neill, when he wins the Pulitzer Prize in the early 1920s. It really signals a huge change in taste in the American theater. And then in film, if you've seen studio system movies, and I hope you have, if you've seen just to think of a great actor of that time, Cary Grant, right? He's one of the greatest actors I've ever seen. But he is not necessarily trying to convince you are watching a real person. He is existing in relationship to a type. He's sort of doing, like if you watch him and bringing up baby, he has the glasses and the tucked in shirt. It's like, oh, well, Captain Equina is a leopard. I'm very upset about these leopards. He's not trying to, you're not thinking like, wow, that's a real nerd over there. You're thinking like, wow, Cary Grant, good nerd. Wait till he takes off his glasses, he'll be so sexy. And so it's replacing that with the idea of these are particular people, this is authenticity. You should not realize you're watching an actor. Actors should be versatile, etc.
And it's also, one of the things that this is a story about is not just a style of acting, but maybe even more kind of an approach to pedagogy.
Yes.
And talk a little bit, you mentioned Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg in the passage that you read, and they become kind of interesting sort of rivals or different poles of the method. And part of the story that you're telling in a way is a kind of familiar one about a mysterious and charismatic guru figure, in this case Stanislavski, who's a little bit like Sigmund Freud in the history of psychoanalysis, or Jesus in the history of Christianity.
Yeah.
And then the people who follow him, because he left some very mysterious and cryptic and not altogether, clear but very emphatic instructions and ideas that it fell to his followers to interpret, and therefore to argue about the correct interpretations of. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of the schisms and sects within that?
So Stanislavski was terrible at explaining himself. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to actually read his books on acting, but they're unreadable. I mean, they're really awful. And he wrote a lot, and some of it contradicts itself, or he uses different terms for the same idea, or he'll make a process or something like ever more elaborate every time he revisits it. And he was a relentless experimentalist who changed his mind a lot. So, especially because he lived a long life and had a long career, there's a huge body of work that you can sort of take what you want from it. To extend the Jesus idea, it's sort of like you take a passage from Mark or a passage from Luke, and you come up with some different ideas. And he wasn't very good at teaching what he called the system either. It was actually other people who mostly taught it. And then the next generation of Russians took his ideas and ran with them and came up with their own ideas that are kind of amazing and beautiful to read about, and also difficult to understand. So when those come over to the United States, you're not getting them from Stanislavski. You're getting them from his pupil, his disciple, his maybe his Matthew or something, Richard Boleslavsky, who writes the first book in English about the system and who teaches it to Stella Adler and Carol Clerman and Lee Strasberg and all sorts of other people. And then after that, you have the generation of Americans who who all come out of the group theater basically, and spend their entire time at the group theater, and then, to be clear, the rest of their lives until the 80s and 90s, arguing with each other about who correctly interpreted Stanislavski. And so, you know, to give you an example, this is from my book, when Lee Strasberg, I happened to interview a guy who told me, oh, by the way, I was in Stella Adler's living room when she found out Lee Strasberg died. Do you want to know what she said when she hung up the phone? And I was like, yes, I want to know what she said when she hung up the phone. And he said, she said, good riddance. Finally, that man will stop ruining actors. So you can see there was no love lost between them. And I was like, oh, shit. So you know, they hated each other. They hated each other in the group, and then they had the schism, and then they hated each other for the rest of the group. And but to get to your actual question on what that schism was about, it's interesting because they both flow from the same source, which is Stanislavski. Strasberg was very interested in the self. And he was very interested in unlocking the particularities and the idiosyncrasies of the actor. And he invented a series of exercises for doing that. It sort of get called the method line. I will skip to the most controversial and juicy. The most controversial and juicy exercises are private moment, where you do something in front of the class that you would only do by yourself as a way of getting you used to being observed. People would sometimes take off their clothes, or they would mime onanism, all sorts of stuff would kind of come up in that context. Another one is, but the even more controversial one, which was the one most associated with the method until about 20 years ago, was the affective memory exercise, which would kind of go, I guess I would say, Tony is searching for grief. He has to feel grief as this character. And so if I was coaching him, I would say, well, think of a time in which you felt grief. Don't tell me the story of the time. Just be relaxed in that chair, close your eyes, and think of that time. And now I want you to just tell me the sensory details of that time. The only reason why you're telling it to me is so that I know you're actually doing the exercise. You don't actually need to, but close your eyes and do it. You can actually look up footage of Ellen Burstyn doing this online. It's wild. And he would close his eyes and he would think about grief, and that antiseptic smell of the hospital and the beeping of the heart monitor, and then suddenly he would start crying, right? And so you would hope through repetition of this exercise, he would eventually just be able to think on stage, antiseptic smell, and that would unlock the emotion. So it's a way of, in our parlance of today, triggering yourself intentionally to experience past trauma. Stella Adler, and she was not alone in this, thought that this was sick, that this was unlicensed psychotherapy practiced by a sick man inflicting his sickness on his students. Her thing started with imagination and with research. And so her idea was that you had to enlarge your soul to be worthy of playing the part. That development as an actor and development as a human being are the same thing. And so if you were to play a role, she would say, don't use any of your life experience. She got more and more adamant about that as her life went on. Instead, you would use imagination. You would try to imaginatively enter the world of the character. And so if you were playing Hamlet in a period production, you would go and look at paintings of 16th century princes to sort of see how they carried their bodies. You would maybe research the real historical figure if you could. You would practice sword fighting, and so that when you held up the goblet, that it felt like a real medieval man holding up a goblet, et cetera, and so forth. And try to live the truth of the behavior.
We have a few more minutes, and then I do want to get to questions from all of you. So I'm going to fast forward very quickly to the end of the book.
Great. Spoilers.
Which is that the method kind of peaks and then sort of fades, so that you have other styles of acting that you talk about that sort of come up in its wake. I think you also have a shift from theater to film and then to television and different kinds of acting that the different media and different business models demand. But I was rereading the end of this today, and I was struck by a very poignant note you hit at the end, where you talk about the method acting answered a desire for not only for authenticity and realism, but for complexity, for the idea that human beings are beautiful and beautiful insofar as they are complicated, and that what you see in great method performances is a kind of representation of that complexity and that mystery, and that what we tend to favor and look for now maybe is something more, is the word you use, I think, is clarity, and we also look forward to use, my least favorite word in talking about performance, relatability, or likability, or characters that we understand, or characters that we approve of. And it struck me that that answered a question that, in a way, I could have begun with, which is, why is it important to know about this now? What is the kind of the impulse between telling this history, which is a wonderful history about old things and old ways of doing things, which is always wonderful to read in its own right. But it does seem maybe to have a particular piquancy or poignancy now. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about kind of what we can learn from the method.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you for I wrote the book actually in the linear order of which, so that afterward really was the last thing that I wrote. It was the moment where I had to think about, well, how do I feel about this thing that I just spent 2 years writing, and about this history that I've been exploring. And what came out of it was that thing that you said, which is, I do feel like as the method starts to fade in the 80s and the teachers die and there's sort of stranglehold on American acting fades, we get this moment of incredible richness and diversity in what it means to be a good actor. I actually love that. I'm not a method partisan by any means. But it's sort of transitioned recently to this drive to clarity, in part because the main struggle that actors have now, on TV particularly, is not being heard or understood, which is historically the major problem of acting, but keeping your attention. And so one of the ways that they keep your attention is that everything's high stakes and it's very clear all the time. I love all that stuff. The Expanse is my favorite TV show. I'm not putting it down. I just want a diversity of opinion, a diversity of approach, because these are fundamentally at heart. This is about what we think a human being is. And that's why I think this history is important for a bunch of different reasons, including it's the story of how we got the taste we have today, because the taste we have today was formed through this history, and what we think good acting is, and what we think truth is, but it's also about what do we think a human being is. And, when you watch a truly great actor, they don't have to be method trained, but a truly great actor who's embracing that complexity. I think of, as I just watched this movie, Olivia Colman in The Lost Daughter, for example. You're seeing this complicated idea of what a person is that is not fully likable, not fully hateable, is trying to survive in this world, is a mystery to themselves, and will fundamentally remain until the end of the film a mystery to you, on some level. Jack Nicholson in 5 Easy Pieces, Francis McDormand in Nomadland, and I just could keep listing these sort of, and I find that to be an accurate depiction of what a human being is. And I worry that as that fades, we are substituting for it this idea that people can fit easily into categories, and that we can easily judge the people who are in those categories, and that what we want is our own ideas of what's good and bad reified. And that stuff is great. Again, I'm not putting it down, but I think we need that other vision as well. And I also think, just to fully answer the question, during the pandemic, especially as we live our lives, so virtually, hello people at home again, watching, thank you for living your life virtually with me right now. We're always performing. And the more we know about how we're performing, and we're now much more conscious of the fact that we're always performing. And so the more that we can understand how those performances are actually constructed, I think the healthier we can live in some way in this era of performance that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. We have some time for questions from the audience, so if you will, in an orderly and civil and, I guess, socially distanced fashion, you can line up behind that microphone in the middle of the aisle. If you have thoughts. Okay. It's really does feel, it's starting to feel like a church service. Do you have a testimony you'd like to share today?
I do, but I'm not going to share it. So,
we're also in a moment where we are consuming filmed entertainment in a much different way.
Totally.
I mean, the Regal is gone, right? So we no longer gather together to watch. And this is, the splintering of the audience has been, sorry, is it okay if I?
I don't mind. I think
Okay.
it's okay for you.
The splintering of the audience has been something that television has been grappling with, what we call television, for a long time. But now it's happening with film. And this film is traditionally, takes longer to make, it's more expensive, it's more time consuming for the performers, for the crew, for everybody. And it was always thought to be more ambitious. But I think what we're losing is this communal, it's the theater. You know, even though it's a screen, it's not actors on a stage, it's the theater. And I wonder how you think everything that came before, including the method, is affecting this, or what the future of film is without people actually paying the money and sitting in a theater and watching it together, without any distractions in a dark room.
Right, I mean, one of the first things I did this week, now the rates are down, so I was like, as soon as possible, I'm going back to a movie theater. And I did, that was like one way of celebrating the book coming out. So I feel you on that. And the movie theater you mentioned there, the Regal, where there was no better place to see a crappy, very expensive to make movie on opening nights. People just scream things at the screen throughout. It was, that was a great communal experience. I do want to hear what Tony thinks about this, obviously, but that atomization is not, all I'll say is that atomization is not new. I mean, I think that we start really fragmenting in the 1980s, which is part of where you get like a real riot of acting styles is reflected in that, which I actually find exciting. But the big thing that's happened is, the blockbuster has only become more and more and more dominant. I saw someone posted on Twitter that, I mean, obviously it's a weird year because of the pandemic, but no non-tentpole IP film made more than $50 million at the American box office this year.
And that even makes it sound high. I mean, it's actually very disturbing what's happening now. And I went through most of the pandemic with a certain amount of optimism that people would come back to the theaters, that people would miss exactly the kind of communal collective experience, and also the experience of kind of scale and size. Whether you're in a theater watching live actors or watching them on a screen, there's a sense of bigger than life. There's a sense of kind of enhancement and enlargement and intensification of experience that I think is very important, that I don't think happens in quite the same way on television, which is very good at certain kinds of intimacy or kind of group behavior, but not quite that. But now I don't want to step on your time because I've thought about this a lot. But now I am a little worried that some of that habit and some of that appetite has been broken, so that there's going to be now a division between the kind of the franchise, tentpole entertainment, which is what mostly young people will leave the house to go see, and everything else people are going to see at home, which means that a lot of what I think of as the most interesting and ambitious cinema is just going to get lost at the bottom of the algorithm, because it can be hard to watch. It can be hard to watch at home. It can be, it doesn't take well to distraction.
Right after we got vaccinated, my friend Darcy, who's in the audience with me, we went to Film Forum to see Le Cercle Rouge. And the thing that's brilliant about Le Cercle Rouge is there's maybe 5 lines of dialogue in it. It's a 3-hour heist movie with almost no dialogue. You have to watch it closely, but it's like a brilliantly told point-by-point story. Everything you need to know is in it. It's just not spoken out loud. And we both, at the end of it, were like, that was amazing. And you know what? You have to retrain to be able to sit there and just watch and not look at your phone and get all the information you need visually. It's like, it felt like I hadn't gone to the gym in 3 years and then tried to run a 10K or something. It's just sort of like, this is such a bizarre experience. And so I do think that it is a habit that you get into, and a habit you can actually, I didn't know you could lose the habit, but it turns out you can.
Yes, and as a sort of a larger cultural loss, that's something that is troubling to contemplate. Is there another question? Okay.
Hi, I'm excited to read your book. I'm curious, your thoughts. I feel like I've started to notice a trend in acting where the casting has become such an influential part of the entertainment that we're seeing, and the casting director's role in. To me, it feels like, and this is not good or bad, but I just feel like I've noticed a trend where we're watching the actor in the part.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your thoughts. And,
I mean, in a weird way, that's actually the thing that the method disrupted originally. Is, you know, in the era of the studio, actors had really clarified and refined types, and the amount of work that went into manufacturing these types is kind of boggling. There's a wonderful book, The Star. Is it called The Star Factory by Bessinger?
The Star System.
The Star System, yeah. If you want to know about Star Machine, the Star Machine, yeah. The first half of that book is just a detailed account of how they made these personae, which is it's totally wild. And in a way, we're kind of returning to that, I think. We're returning to that idea that an actor is playing a role, and that role is in dialogue with their persona. There's some actors who are allowed to not do that, particularly of an older generation, or, you know, like, I think we pick a few who are allowed to not do that, and then if those films are successful, they get to continue not doing that, like Oscar Isaac and Adam Driver. And there was like a 3-year period where Jessica Chastain didn't have to do that, and then she was in everything, and she, you know. And so it's a weird way, and like it almost feels like a neoclassical revival or something in terms of how we watch acting. And I don't really know what's going to come of that. It's a strange thing. I think, in particular, though, blockbuster filmmaking is going to rely on that even more than it already does. That, you know, if you see Chris Pratt in a part, you know that it's going to be sort of like in dialogue with him just being an apple doofus. You know, and even if the character is literally a rocket scientist or something, you're not going to really believe that. That's not the part that's important. The part that's important is that he's an apple doofus. You know. Yeah. Another question?
Yeah, hi. I'm just curious, in terms of the research and interview process, with a lot of the people holding on to the method, did you find them protective or proprietary in any way that felt, I don't know, I want to see you kind of going on a mystery hunt of some sort, where you're uncovering something that got you a little dirty?
People were less protective of Lee Strasberg than I thought they were going to be when I interviewed them, you know, because I interviewed people who were very, very devoted to him during his life. But they would just be very, very open about, like, no, Lee sometimes confused neurosis with talent, or, you know, whatever it was. So, and in fact, if you read the histories of the Actors Studio or the biography of Lee Strasberg by Cindy Adams, people are just, even while he was alive, they were very open about, you know, he was a very difficult and peculiar person. He was prone to rages. There's a quote from his biography that's in the book where he says he doesn't understand the purpose of hello and goodbye. And he's like, who says hello? That's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard in my life. Why would you say hello to someone? So I mean, you know, like that's the kind of, you know, so he was a difficult guy. So I did find less protectiveness of him than I assumed. And at the same time, though, people are very, very devoted to the ideas and to the theories. And I didn't feel like it was my job necessarily to challenge them on that. It was more my job to try to understand as best as possible their point of view so that it could be portrayed accurately. I was trying, for the most part in this book, to, you know, I keep talking about it like it's a biography, but not of a person. It's a biography of an idea. And I want, in the way a good biography does, to make you feel like you're living alongside of it while it's happening. And so I tried to get out of the way and let the other people kind of speak for themselves. It was always in terms of the treasure hunt, the best parts of the treasure hunt are digging through people's papers at the Library of Congress, at the Ransom Center, and stuff like that, to really learn about how they talked and how they thought, and to read, you know, Stella, there's lists of books she wants to read, you know, she would handwrite them in there, you know, all these pictures of her house parties and just getting to know who they were as people since they're now dead was the most pleasurable, I think, part of that treasure.
We have time for one more, if there's another question out there. If not, I will ask it, which is a question that I actually asked you on the phone when I called you up after I read this book, which is that as I was reading this book in the fall, the first time through, I was kind of reading it as a sort of, elegy for the method. And then right around that time, on social media and in entertainment journalism, it seemed like I couldn't hear about anything else but the method. So this was either there was Lady Gaga, there was Robert Pattinson, there was a whole like BuzzFeed set of memes about crazy method acting, which meant that Daniel Day-Lewis went around wearing a top hat all the time when he was playing Abraham Lincoln, or that Robert Pattinson, never took a bath and got so drunk, he walked around covered in his own vomit, and Lady Gaga spoke an Italian accent for 6 months. And I was reading your book and I was thinking, well, this isn't really what the method is. But it's clearly still an idea that has some purchase and some importance and fascination. So my question in a way is, what is that about? What is this sort of like kind of incorrect but nonetheless somehow connected idea of the method that seems to be everywhere?
First of all, I just really wish at this point that I would in Mission Impossible style, rip off my face and reveal that I was Lady Gaga this whole time. I was just really going for it in character.
See, I thought the whole thing was like a brilliant stealth publicity.
Well, I do owe, I should give Michael Schulman like a fruit basket for writing that Jeremy Strong profile before my book came out. Because people are really into it. So the connection is actually that thing that we call the method, which is not what it actually is the connection is actually sort of like a parody of Stella Adler's idea of how you should approach a part. And the way that we get it is through, one of the weird ironies of the story is the two most famous actors and influential actors associated with the method are Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro, and neither of them studied with or liked Lee Strasberg. They both studied with Stella Adler. And it's really Robert De Niro who takes Stella Adler's ideas about how you prepare to play a part and pushes them to their furthest possible extreme in the work that he does in the 70s, which culminates in Raging Bull. And we probably all know the stories of his preparation for Raging Bull. He learns how to box. He spends time with Jake LaMotta's family. He breaks Jake LaMotta's tooth one time because Jake LaMotta trains him how to box. He, records them to learn how their speech patterns. He works out like them, and then of course he famously gains 60 pounds eating his way through Italy and France over the course of a couple months to play the washed-up Jake LaMotta at the end. And that film wins the Best Actor Oscar, and everyone kind of learns about that process. And it starts inspiring people. It actually, weirdly, inspires Meryl Streep when she's doing Sophie's Choice, which then inspires Al Pacino when he plays Scarface. And by the end of the 80s, everyone who wants an Oscar is trying, and sure enough, it becomes the way to get publicity. It becomes the way to get awards attention. And many people, including your uncle, Eli Wallach, are very dismissive of this idea. And Eli Wallach's one of the great method actors of the 20th century. He's like, this isn't the method, this isn't acting, this is a PR campaign. Robert De Niro's a great actor, he doesn't need to do this. But now it's what people think the method is. And it's really, I think, because of all those wonderful performances that De Niro did, and then eventually that Daniel Day-Lewis did. But there's a period of time in the 80s when the actors are doing that, and reporters are like, so, Daniel Day-Lewis, is this the method? And he's like, no, I don't like the method. This isn't the method. I'm just trying to figure out how to be in this wheelchair for 6 months, and so I've got to go live in this wheelchair for 6 months. But now it's what we think of as the method. So it does still connect to Stanislavski, and it does connect to that idea that you're trying to live the person. And that you're not trying to fully become them because that would actually be crazy, but you're trying to live the person's lived reality in all of its particulars and specificities, and in the beautiful idiosyncrasies of that person. And yes, there's a parodic version of that, Jared Leto and the used condoms that he sent his co-stars or whatever. But at its heart, it does connect back to the thing that is the root of the method.
All right. Well, thank you. There's much more that we could say. And I encourage you all, if you don't already have the book, go out and buy it from people there and bring it back here for Isaac to sign. It's just a wonderful read full of ideas and history and personalities and gossip and 75 and 80-year-old dirt that is as shocking today as the day it happened. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much once again for joining us, including those tuning in virtually. Once again, should have picked up your copy, but if you didn't get it, you can get it at the table where you checked